Hi everyone, and welcome to After Dark Analysis. Today we will be talking about the polarizing fever dream known as Mother. For those of you that might be looking for a very rough and dirty, spoiler-free answer to the question what this film is about, it's about the Bible. These are biblical allegories and stories from the writer-director who is a very big environmentalist as well as an atheist. For those that came for a more in-depth analysis, we're going to start breaking it down. We open on a shot of a woman being engulfed in fire, then cutting to a man putting a gem on display in an office. These things are noteworthy, but won't come back until much later in the film, so just keep them in mind. We see a house go from burnt to more or less fine. It's a bit on the older side. It's clearly having some work done to it, but it looks structurally sound and doesn't look like it was really ever touched by fire. We see a woman wake up who we later identify as Mother. She goes and looks for her husband, who is only ever referred to in the film as him. She eventually goes outside to look, and we see a nice big sprawling landscape. It is clear that this house stands on a decent amount of land and isn't really close to anybody else. When she goes outside to look, her husband kind of sneaks up behind her and scares her a little bit. He says he needed to be alone, but then clarifies, I needed to clear my head. She tries to be affectionate, but he runs off to shower, even though she says she doesn't mind. We cut to her working on one of the walls in the home. I'm not 100% certain on what she is doing here, but I have reason to believe that she is mudding the wall. During this process, she puts her hand up to the wall and she hears, and we see a visual of a heart beating. So she is very connected with this house. Her husband comes down and she serves him this massive breakfast. He goes on about how she didn't need to do all this. She tells him about how she wanted to because he works so hard. He gives a rather flippant, yeah, right. Breakfast is interrupted by a knock at the door. When they go to get it, there is a man claiming to be an orthopedic surgeon who had just started at the hospital. He was told this house was a B&B where he could find a room. Clearly not true. This is this couple's private residence, and you can tell Mother is not very thrilled about being interrupted, but is polite and offers them tea. While making the tea, she hears a high-pitched noise and becomes disoriented, causing her to drop the teacup. And this again is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout the film, so please keep it in mind. When she joins her husband and the doctor in the living room, and they're drinking even though it's early morning, the husband insists that the home is too big for the both of them and welcomes the doctor to stay. Shortly after this invitation, the doctor starts having a coughing fit, which allows Mother to pull her husband aside and go, "Look, I don't want random strangers staying at my house." He is persistent and begrudgingly, she agrees. It's revealed that the husband is a writer, and the doctor is a big fan who has read their work many, many times. This is where it seems appropriate to start getting into the symbolism. The husband, who is never named and only ever referred to as him, represents God. Mother represents Mother Earth. The doctor, only ever referred to as man, is a representation of Adam. The home is supposed to be the earth. If we take Adam as a representation of mankind overall, which is typically the way it's intended biblically, this all kind of ties together. The reason I believe Mother was mudding the wall is because in her attempting to repair the wall with a process known as mudding, which references one of the most basic things on Earth, made of dirt and water, metaphorically it fits. Since these characters for the most part go unnamed, to stave off the grammatical nightmare this episode could have been, I'm going to start referring to them by what they're supposed to represent. I'd also like to be clear here, when I say God, I am referring to the Christian God. While religious texts from all different factions of life do have some crossover, this is what's been confirmed by the director, so that is why the comparison is coming directly from Christian belief and dogma. God walks Adam up into his office and shows him the gem he had placed earlier in the film. He talks about how there was a fire and everything was lost, but that somehow survived. He says it's very delicate, it was a gift. He talks about how the house was engulfed in flames and how Mother has been doing all the repair work. They only moved in a few months ago, so the structure's currently good, it's just the interior that she needs to work on. And he admits he wouldn't have been able to do any of this or any of his writing or try and get back to what he was doing or creating without Mother. And after hearing all this, Adam begins to have another coughing fit. We cut to later on in the evening. Both God and Adam have stayed up while Mother was in bed. She comes down to look for them and finds Adam in the bathroom throwing up. One thing that is also important to point out, and how we can definitely deduce this is Adam, while he's vomiting, we see some blood on his shirt, and there is a wound that is where his rib would be. The next morning when Mother awakes, she sees an ashtray with butts in it. Adam does smoke, and she had asked him repeatedly not to smoke in the house. So seeing an ashtray with butts in it means, yeah, he was probably smoking in the house. She passive-aggressively flicks his lighter behind an armoire. After this action, though, she gets disoriented again, and she sees visions of a burnt house. She runs upstairs to the bathroom and pours a yellow powder into water, which gives it kind of a glow. There's been a lot of questions, and this is never really properly explained in the film. There's a couple of different theories. The first is the powder is a reference to the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. This story follows a woman who is slowly driven insane by her husband's constant insistence on submission, and that is definitely a theme we will see throughout this film. Another theory is due to her being disoriented and kind of labored breathing each time. The powder could be some kind of anti-anxiety medication. Given the fact that it's an unlabeled vial, it's safe to say this is not prescribed by a doctor, and probably a more holistic treatment. The going theory is kava. The issue is kava is more of a brownish, but apparently in certain teas it can give off a yellowish hue. One thing I'd like to point out though is later on in the film, she is seen pouring yellow pigment into what looks like stucco to do the wall. I'm not saying she's eating pigment that goes in stucco, but the color being the same as well as the bottle being the same shows that connection not only to the home, but by extension Earth. Both Adam and God come downstairs as she's preparing breakfast. Adam lights a cigarette off the stove and immediately assures her he's taking it outside, don't worry. She kind of asks how he's feeling because she saw him throwing up last night, and he says he's feeling great. All of a sudden there's another knock at the door. A woman arrives who is Adam's wife. She's only ever referred to as woman. The injury to the rib earlier and some behaviors on down the line are what leads us to believe this is Eve and not Lilith. While they're talking and introducing themselves to each other and just trying to figure out who is who and what's going on, the smoke alarm starts to go off. Breakfast is burning, so Mother runs in to try and put it out. She lightly touches a cast iron skillet, and if you've never handled a cast iron skillet, they are just that. They are completely metal. There is no plastic handle. She inadvertently touches it lightly and burns herself. Very soon after, Eve comes in and goes, "Oh, I'll help." While Mother's telling her not to, she grabs the cast iron skillet rather hard and burns her hand, not terribly, but enough. Mother gets her some ice and a towel to put in her hand. Introductions are kind of then done over the fire alarm. We cut to Mother actually serving breakfast, which we're assuming she recooked because the other stuff was clearly burnt. Over chit-chat, the topic of children come up. Adam and Eve have 2 children, which is a reference unto itself that we'll get to later. God says he wants children, and Mother seems surprised. It's clear that they have been married for a little while now, and that's typically a conversation you have pretty early into the relationship. Do you want kids? Do you not want kids? So Mother's clearly uncomfortable. Once breakfast ends, she goes back to working on the house. Eve kind of stumbles in to talk to Mother, hands her a lemonade, which you find out has alcohol in it. Eve is still complaining about how her hand hurts and asks for painkillers. They don't have any in the house, and Mother is still incredibly apologetic for Eve burning her hand. Almost too apologetic for it, considering Mother had said repeatedly, "Don't touch the pan," and of course Eve did, just like a disobedient child would when they're learning what's hot. So it's clear she feels guilt, but it seems like there's almost too much guilt given the situation and the fact that this is supposed to be two grown women interacting. Adam eventually questions Mother as to why they rebuilt the house instead of just building a new house. She goes on a massive spiel about how this is where her husband wanted to create, and she is going to go out of her way to make it as comfortable as she can to allow him the space he needs to do that. To which Eve responds, wow, you really love him. It's clear that she is very devoted to her husband, but it's questionable how much that devotion comes back. And that is, again, a question and a theme we're going to see a lot throughout this film. Soon after, when Eve and Mother are left alone, she calls her out on her surprise at breakfast over the discussion of kids. Basically straight up asking Mother why she doesn't want them. I know that sentence was really, really weird. Eve says creating something together is what keeps a marriage going. This, in reference to the home, is all just setting. Basically saying that Mother Earth should be involved with God's creations and not worry so much about the aesthetic. Almost immediately after this conversation happens, Eve notices the office upstairs. But as she's running up, Mother stops her and keeps saying he doesn't like people in there alone. To which she responds, you really do love him. God help you. Kind of funny when you think of who they're talking about. Adam and God burst in talking about how they're going to go on a hike. Apparently Adam isn't a big fan of hiking, but he's going anyway. She points out that they have laundry to do, looks over at Mother and says, you'll show me where it is. They go down into the basement and gives a condescending, oh, guess you haven't gotten to this part yet. She begins to pull their wet clothes out of the washer to put them on the concrete floor, and then starts pushing Mother as to why her and her husband are not having sex. Eventually pulling out a pair of her underwear and mocking them, saying you have to try harder than this, and showing a pair of her underwear that is a lot skimpier, talking about how marriage can get boring and you have to learn to spice things up. She keeps this line of inquiry about their sex life going, even when Mother states multiple times she is uncomfortable and wants to change the subject. Eventually Eve leaves, saying that she's going to freshen up their drinks. The thing to note here is Eve was only holding her drink. Mother wasn't carrying hers around. It's probably still in the living room, that even though she maybe only took a few sips of it. Once Mother gets laundry going, she comes upstairs to find her kitchen completely trashed. She goes upstairs and finds that the sink in the bathroom is running and that there's bloody tissues all around. So she starts cleaning that up, and when she goes to flush the bloody tissues, she notices a bit of blood in the toilet. There's a lot of debate over what this is, and it's never fully explained in the film. The biggest going theory, though, is that it's some kind of human tissue, either a heart or intestines. When she kind of fiddles with it with a plunger, it makes a kind of high-pitched noise, spurts blood, and disappears down the commode. Mother comes out of the bathroom and starts just trying to tidy up the room. By happenstance, she sees a picture of her husband in their luggage. She realizes that Eve is up in the office that she explicitly told her not to be in. So Mother goes up, tells her to get out. She puts on a massive attitude about it. Just so happens that the men come home around the same time that this is going on. Mother pulls her husband aside and says, there's something going on here. Apparently Adam had confessed all of that to him on the walk. He has already forgiven him because he says Adam is dying and meeting him was one of his last wishes, kind of his bucket list item. Once they're done having this conversation, they hear a crash from upstairs. Adam and Eve have not only gone into his office, they've broken the gem. He loses it to the point where they run out of the office and downstairs. She attempts to console him. He says, sorry, I yelled, but then gets angry with her, so she leaves and goes to kick Adam and Eve out of the house. So essentially what happens here is they go into a place they weren't supposed to be, break something they weren't even supposed to be touching, and then get kicked out. It's pretty straightforward what we're referencing here. When she looks back into the office, she sees him holding the shards of the gem so tightly that it's pushing into his hand and starting to bleed. Once he notices her, he yells, please, and she leaves as well to go downstairs to enforce kicking them out, only to stumble across them having sex in the room that they're staying in, or, original sin. She goes upstairs to see him bash the doorknob off of the office door. There is an exchange between the two about how he wants to ensure they'll never get in there again. She says, "Don't worry, I'm kicking them out." And he goes, "Where will they go?" She's fed up with the entire thing, storms down to the basement, gets all of their clothes out of the washer, walks back upstairs with just a massive pile of wet clothes. Well, God is nailing bits of wood over the door so they cannot get into the office again. She knocks on the room where they're staying. Eve is only shown from the waist up and is wearing a bra that's barely on. And Mother says, "We need you to leave." Eve fires back with, "We or you." Her husband begins to have a coughing fit in the background and says she needs to go check on him and slams the door shut. And then a young man just kind of strolls on through the door and starts yelling, "Where is everyone?" Mother walks over and says, "What are you doing here?" because this stranger just entered her home. He responds back with, "What are any of us doing here? Am I right?" Another guy shows up and all hell breaks loose. The scene is very intentionally chaotic. They're fighting over trusts. Assets are apparently put into a trust that requires all parties to agree with a decision. That is how we find out this is Adam and Eve's two sons. This fight eventually turns physical, and during this there's a lot of talk, obviously, of the trust, but some about how their mother and father loved you more. The first son to arrive ends up on the floor with his head cracked open. The second son, obviously the one who hurt the first son, now has a very deep gash in his head. The gash in the forehead resembles the mark of Cain. So it makes it clear that these two are Cain and Abel. The mark of Cain was a curse put on Cain by God for murdering his brother Abel and lying about it. Because while everybody is attempting to get, we're just going to call him Abel now, out of the house, he was saying, "It wasn't my fault, it was an accident, I don't know how this happened." Adam, Eve, and God rush to get Abel to the hospital. Mother stands there confused, trashed furniture around her, blood on her floor, saying, "Please don't leave me." And during all of this confusion, Cain just runs. Mother starts to try and clean the blood off of herself and sees a fly repeatedly bash itself against the kitchen window, eventually dying. And because it's an Aronofsky film and we've spent more than 5 seconds looking at this fly dying, it's clearly significant and most likely a metaphor for how Mother is feeling right now. Very trapped, very stagnant, very uncomfortable in her own home. She takes off her blood-stained clothing, ties her hair into a knot, and goes to start cleaning up the blood on the floor. When she touches the wall, she hears the heartbeat again. It's still a relatively healthy heartbeat, but it's a little slower than it was last time. When she goes to touch the blood on the floor breaks away and creates a hole down into the basement. Because of this hole in the floor, she goes into the basement and finds a room that was hidden with an oil tank in it. When she goes upstairs, she sees that Cain has come back. He says, "They left you all alone. You do understand." He grabs something that looks like a wallet and then walks off and says good luck. She calls 911 but hangs up immediately when everybody comes back in. Her husband sees that she's distressed and goes to get her some water. Cutting to later on in the evening, we see her standing in the bedroom and her husband's taken up all of the bed. All of a sudden, a wave of people just start coming into the house. Her husband immediately wakes up and starts dressing himself. She goes downstairs, she sees Eve, knowing that they have lost Abel, and says, "I'm so sorry." This is met with an eye roll and her just walking off. God ends up giving a speech about Abel and what little bit he knew about him. He refers to the crying happening at the memorial as sounds of life, and more people just keep pouring in for this impromptu memorial service. Eve thanks their host for his hospitality, putting the emphasis on his and clearly avoiding Mother. Adam has been holding it together emotionally until he says his son should be eulogizing him and not the reverse. Mother is asked to speak, and stunned just says, "I'm sorry for your child." God quickly corrects her and says, "Both of your children. Let's not forget the one who's still in the wilderness." So again, we're assuming Cain's still out in the woods. Even though he came back to the house as a slight nod to the prodigal son, he didn't stay. When she, obviously embarrassed and still completely stunned because she's just had wave after wave of stranger pouring into her home for the past few days, when she walks into the kitchen to check what in the world's going on, she sees somebody sitting on a sink that she says is unbraced and please get off of it. When she goes back out into the main area and where the memorial is being held, she sees Eva once again and again tries to give her condolences. She goes on about how you could never understand if you didn't have children. You give and you give and you give, and it's never enough. When she tries to relate to Eve's pain, even though she does not have a child in the literal sense, she calls her out and says you could at least wear something decent. Mother looks down and remembers she's only is she in her pajamas, they are white, which tends to be considered in many cultures very disrespectful to wear to a funeral. She goes up to her bedroom to change and sees a couple making out in there and has to repeatedly tell them to leave. Once again, just hammering home the disrespect that's being shown to her and her house. She starts to see visions of the house being burned again, so she goes into the bathroom and consumes more of the yellow powder. An old man just walks right in to the bathroom and says, "Oh, just exploring." When she's kind of dressed and ready to come back out, she has to tell another couple to please go downstairs. They look at her kind of mockingly saying, "This way." She's like, "Yes," because there's only really one way to go downstairs. When Mother makes her way downstairs, she's handed a drink by a man, and people are painting her home. When she questions why they're painting her house, because that's kind of a weird thing to do, they say it's as repayment for her hospitality. She then has to beg them to stop painting her house, because A, they're kind of going over everything indiscriminately, and B, she's still got to work on the house, so paint's normally the last thing you do. She finds where her husband is. He refers to her as his goddess, and people seem mildly put off and inconvenienced by the fact that they are asked to make room for her to sit in her own living room. A drink is spilled, and she says she'll go clean it up. As she walks in the kitchen to get paper towels, somebody is again sitting on the sink, which she says is unbraced. "Please get off." A man just comes up to her and starts hitting on her, asking her who she is. She keeps pointing out that this is her house, and clearly married. Every time she turns around, though, this person's still back on the unbraced sink. So we get this cut between her rejecting this guy that's hitting on her, while these people keep getting on the sink, even though she keeps politely saying, "Please don't do that." Eventually, two people get on the unbraced sink and start bouncing up and down, saying, "No, really, it's okay." While the man she keeps rejecting says, "Get out of my fucking face, you arrogant cunt." She turns back around to see the sink break. Water starts going everywhere, and she understandably screams for everyone to leave. Keeping with the biblical allegories, Mother Nature repeatedly asked humanity not to do something. They did it anyway, mocking her in the process, causing the Great Flood that wiped out most of humanity, hence all the guests leaving when she yelled to get out, even though no one had really been listening to her or doing what she said beforehand. This leads to Mother and God having a massive fight. She points out that she's feeling her needs are being ignored, which no one can argue in this movie. She hasn't made anything but reasonable requests that were overlooked. Her not wanting to have strangers in, her not wanting people to damage her home, all reasonable things to ask for. God goes on about how he hates the house and how he feels suffocated there. He says he wants to have all these new people to breathe new life into it, but she won't allow that. Eventually, she calls him out on the fact that they are not having sex, which leads to them having sex. The next morning, Mother wakes up just knowing that she is pregnant. God runs off to the living room to write. Mother's just excited that he's writing again because apparently it's been a struggle. She says, "I don't want to interrupt, all get started on the apocalypse. At face value, this is just a joke to the destroyed house from the party the night before, but Great Flood wiping out most of humanity? Yeah, that's typically considered an apocalyptic event. She is feeling so much better, though, to the point where she actually flushes the yellow powder down the toilet. We cut to what we are assuming is months later. She is working on the nursery, and she keeps moving a rug over the blood stain where Abel's blood was. Obviously, this is a band-aid for a bigger problem because, yeah, you don't see the hole anymore, but it's still very much there. She feels the baby kick, and given her reaction, it seems like this is the first time it's kicked. So she runs off to tell God. He's at the door saying, "I finished it." She says, "May I?" and sits on the step to read it. While she's reading, she's envisioning their burnt home, and life is just springing up all around it, and she begins to cry. She's clearly touched by this. She hands it back, praising his work, only to find out that he is called his publicist, and they have read the manuscript before she did. Cut to what we assume is a couple of months later. She is dressed up and very, very pregnant. She's making a several-course candlelit meal to celebrate the fact that every single copy of his book was sold in a day. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. A whole bunch of press and fans have showed up. He tells her to keep the food warm and swears he'll be right back. She's obviously upset, but she sees the hole that she put the rug over is now bleeding through that rug. The noise outside their house just gets louder and louder, and she begins to panic. The crowd just starts getting bigger and bigger, and there are flash bulbs going off every which way. When she goes outside, someone tries to grab her, and she says, "Get away from me." When she kind of talks to God about how, hey, I really would prefer us celebrate and have this dinner and not have a whole big mob outside, he argues, but they've come so far. Eventually just yelling at him, "I'm having your baby, isn't that enough for you?" Frustrated and confused at the situation, she goes back inside to find a woman with a child trying to find a bathroom. Originally, she's very upset they're in the house, but she sees the kid is wetting himself. So takes him to the bathroom and says, "Can you please leave right after you're done?" But when she opens up the bathroom door, there's just some random guy in there yelling that she opened the door on him and bitching about privacy, even though he came into her home and was using the bathroom. She then sees this really long line to the bathroom, and there's another man setting up to take a nap. When she points out, "Hey, you really can't sleep in the middle of my floor," the poet refers to God, her husband, him, whatever name you want to put in here. That is who they are talking about when they say the poet. More and more people once again flood into the home. They start taking the food that she's prepared, and they set up a signing. When she walks out to inspect all the commotion, his publicist sees her and calls her the inspiration, and goes on about how worried she was that he was just going to be held up with some woman and never write again. During all this, she catches a woman trying to steal an ornamental pot. When she attempts to stop the woman from stealing it, they have a tugging match and it falls to the floor and breaks. People immediately go in to grab the shards, and she says, "Great, now I have to find something else." After which, everybody just starts stealing things. She goes to call 911 because she's having a whole bunch of random people stealing stuff from her. While she's making the call, another woman grabs the phone. Mother understandably says, "I was using that," to which she responds, "It's okay to share like the poet said." During this conversation, a man comes up and literally rips the landline out of the wall and runs off with it, which causes the woman that took the phone from Mother to get indignant. I'll let you let the irony of that sink in for a moment. This is where the film starts to get very chaotic and hard to follow. I'm going to try and just hit the highlights and what's important. Because when I said fever dream of the film, this is what I'm talking about. It's just very pushed together. Things make sense when you're looking at it, but when you try and pull away and look at it objectively, how nonsensical it all is really becomes clear. Mother goes out and sees that everybody is getting their faces marked, specifically on the forehead, like you would on Ash Wednesday. Some of these marks even resemble a bit of the mark of Cain that we saw earlier in the film. They start holding a ceremony, kind of celebration of sorts, around the original manuscript. There are fistfights happening, one room literally turns into a nightclub, and the theft still stays rampant, to the point where it digresses to people literally tearing the walls apart, while another man is painting on them, and the hole in the floor is just getting bigger and bigger. But instead of just being a black hole like it was before, the edges now look like coal or fire when it's burning down, where you have that slight layer of ash, but everything has that glow about it, and this hole causes her to trip, and she is able to get herself back up, but it's complicated because she's, again, very pregnant. God eventually finds her and is begging her to stay by his side, to which she responds, "You don't want me here." Because, again, every single need, every single request she has had throughout this film, no matter how reasonable, has been ignored. So, of course, she's not feeling welcome even in her own home. The police eventually show up, and she's freaking out trying to get out of there because she's terrified for her baby and that somebody's going to hit her or something's going to happen to cause her to miscarry. And while begging for help, she gets maced. She's able to wash her face off with what's clearly water, which isn't what you want to do with mace at all. You do not want to apply water, it'll make it worse. But in this universe, it worked. Now, barbed wire fences have sprung up around her. Somebody pushes her against a wall to check her teeth, which unfortunately could be a reference to 1,000,001 different kind of terrible world events. Because typically when people were taken to internment camps, their teeth were checked for fillings or things of value. And during the slave trade, you do the exact same things. So that particular moment can be a reference to any number of things, or just an attempt to show how dehumanizing her current situation is. There are riots, there are fires. She starts having contractions. And every time she has a contraction, the earth around her shakes. She sees God's publicist, and they have people with bags over their heads that they are just shooting execution style. She looks at her and goes, "The inspiration, where have you been hiding?" Finish her to the people around her. She's luckily able to get away, but they say, "We've got 6 more. We have somebody whose only job is to worry about the reputation and public perception of God, destroying people that clearly saw something that they shouldn't have." And it's no secret at all that several gospels are banned or destroyed. A soldier shows up and desperately tries to help Mother, but his jaw's blown off before he's able to. She just starts crawling through the rubble, and God once again finds her. He says, "I have to take you somewhere safe," and she's excited because she just wants to get away from all of this. She keeps begging him to go towards the door, which will lead them outside where she's going to feel safe. But he goes, "No, we have to go deeper into the house." While he's trying to take her to somewhere he feels is safe, he's spotted by a bunch of people, and they all begin to yell, "He has not forsaken us," and they swarm. As they swarm, the earth again shakes with another contraction. As they go upstairs, there's this big group that he says will protect them, and he says, "I will return," and leaves. She's left in a room and ends up being in the care of a woman because the crowd kind of dissipates, who's trying to help her through the contractions and the birth. Once he returns to the room, they close the door behind them, and it's just the two of them. And the earth just keeps shaking because she is having contractions closer and closer together now. She does have her baby, and it's completely healthy. She keeps begging him to make them go away, though, because she just wants to be alone with her baby and the father of her child. He walks out, and she assumes it's to make them leave. He comes back in with fresh clothes for the baby, and she keeps saying, make them leave. And he says they want to see him. She says no, and God admits, "I don't want them to go." Because of this, Mother refuses to let him hold the baby. Eventually, he argues, "I am his father," to which she very quickly comes back with, "I am his mother." And she makes it incredibly clear at this point, no one else is touching this child but her, because she is so hurt, confused, and upset by the situation right now. She doesn't want to risk somebody hurting her child. Eventually, the crowd comes in and steals the baby. They essentially crowd surf it across the house, killing it in the process. And if that wasn't heavy-handed enough, they sit the baby's corpse down on an altar, and people begin to take pieces of it and eat it. Obvious reference to communion, where you're told you're consuming the body and blood of Christ. Mother is hysterical at this point, and just begs everybody to stop. She gets a knife and starts stabbing them repeatedly, but is struck down before she can do too much damage and is kicked, called a whore, a pig, spit on. Eventually God comes back in, and she's crying, "They killed my baby." He argues we can't let him die for nothing. What happened could change everything and everyone. We have to find a way to forgive them. We now cut to the heart we have seen beating within the house. The heart has turned black, and we see it beat one last time. She keeps screaming no and murderers, and that it's time to get the fuck out of my house. This is the second time Mother is completely broken in this film and yelled at everybody to get out, and they've actually obeyed. During this exodus, her husband is just screaming, "Please don't leave me," to the crowd. She grabs the doctor's lighter that she flicked behind the armoire earlier in the film, goes down into the basement, and pours the oil from the tanks all over herself. When he tries to stop her, she says, "You never loved me. You loved how much I loved you. I gave you everything, and you gave it all away," and then proceeds to light herself on fire. She comes to, and he's carrying her. Her body's obviously scorched. She says, "Where are you taking me?" He says, "The beginning." They begin to have a conversation about everything, and he admits, "Nothing is ever enough. I couldn't create if it was. Now I must try it all again." She begs, "No, let me go," but he says, "I need one last thing. It's still in there, isn't it?" She says, "Go ahead and take it," to which he reaches into her chest and begins to move his hand around. As she shrivels up and turns to ash, he pulls out the gem from the beginning. He takes the gem, places it back in his office, and we cut to the beginning of the film with Mother waking up again. And as the credits roll, we hear "The End of the World," which was originally popularized by Skeeter Davis. I would play you the song, but I don't want to anger the copyright gods. But I assure you, no one who has played a video game or watched a movie has not heard this song. And just a few small touches I'd like to bring up. At no point in the film does Mother wear shoes, whether she's outside or in the house. It was just a way of showing her connection to Earth and her surroundings. The writer and director referenced Susan Griffin's 1978 book, Women in Nature, as a major influence for the film, telling The Hollywood Reporter there's absolutely a connection of how both women and the environment are treated. Another major influence for this film was Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, specifically the phrase, "And she loved the boy very, very much, even more than she loved herself," which we can see relates directly to the speech Mother gives before she sets herself on fire. So that is what Mother is about. As I said, this is a very polarizing film. Some people absolutely loved it and thought it was brilliant. Some people couldn't stand it and thought it was way too heavy-handed. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. As always, if you like what you're seeing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're seeing, please leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you.